after all, you have to see, you talk about money, and otherwise it's the national security, and we're talking about governance in other situations. They're trying to turn the track into public service. The minister, Ayelet Shaked, said it, yes, you can appoint a minister, but why is that point of balance between governance and the rule of law is not exactly where you'd like it to be? Well, this kind of overrated term that everyone is going overboard with governance, I'd like to explain a little bit. First and foremost, the government and the Knesset, they have authorities to actually carry out policy that they were elected to do so. But if you're talking about the law, the rule of law, I think it is incumbent upon you to basically put down various limits of that, and it safeguards governance so that they'll be able to act in the framework of those limitations. But what can do? I know what is good. No, what is good for us, that does not suffice. It has to be good. That doesn't mean naturally that it's good for the public. And by the way, that's not something that has started nowadays. The Chief Justice Shamgar, when he was the Attorney General to the government, he wanted to put those limitations down. But in those times, they wanted to cut back on his actual authority, and he didn't like it, and he wouldn't allow it. And in his book, that book sort of left me as if we're now talking sort of about something that happened years ago, and it's now present as well, and exactly the same is happening. But there's always a tension. No one likes to be limited. No one likes to wield pressure and sort of breathe down their necks. Now let us talk about the tension between Barak and Begin as the Attorney General, and especially as the Chief Justice, and between Rivlin and other people. Now what is new nowadays? New is this kind of effort to delegitimize, literally delegitimize the judicial arm. And that is what I'm talking about. First, they disseminate stories. It's about that Cossack, do you remember, in the days gone by? You disseminate stories about the High Court and this court and about the judicial and people, and they say that the public doesn't believe in you. Who is the public? That's all they knew about the court, whether it was true or not true. Can one truly ensure that this will not permeate to the awareness of a judge who is sitting in front of his keyboard and paper deciding whether he should intervene or not, whether he should give an edict, whether he should decide on a certain decision, some kind of injunction or not? Do you really think that it won't, all those trumpets blowing, won't permeate his sort of conscience? After all, will he be able to fill his conscience according to his conscience and he doesn't need to be disconnected totally from the public, but the way things sort of roll over, an involvement in public, of course, naturally, public does, the courts reflect what the public believes in. But to say that there's pressure wielded on him or influence, no, because he is measured according to that. He can't say, oh, I think that the government will like it less, they'll cast less aspersions against us. He won't do that. He or she won't do that. But there are times when you can intervene and there are times when you can't. Perhaps does it to a certain degree. I'm not asking you about personally. I'm just talking in general, sort of possibility. Well, judges are human beings. No one can sign that they definitely not influenced. Of course, the entire public service, you spoke about me personally, throughout the path, when you're in the actual executive arm, judicial arm, people don't always like what you say, and you have to decide to what degree. After all, I mean, every court has various limitations. But there's a problem when there is a head-on collision between the basic norms and between what is happening per se. And to my chagrin, and it's not a matter of gossip, but it emanates from sort of total transparency. After all these voices have been heard, a fear that they might actually sabotage the appointment. Well, if I say that something that people won't actually believe in, I didn't think it was a matter of life or death. You cannot sell yourself for a role. I don't like saying it because that is exactly the truth. To have a Chief Justice who someone has done a favor to, okay. But that is part of the whole concept. I mean, when we talk about seniority and that whole argument about it, it's become a big issue. There's no problem of enforcement of law. There's no criminal issues that are really sort of outstanding. No, but when you say it like that, it reminds me that my mother always used to say, you've got time to go to a friend, but you haven't got time to hang the washing. No, but here it's as if there isn't time for everything. But that's the question. Have you got time for everything? Now, if we talk about seniority, is it true because it was always like that? Well, first and foremost, according to what I believe in my credo, it always was like that, because that was some kind of sort of various constitutional conventions. After all, our history is short, but 70 years is already something you can say tradition. There isn't a perfect system for anything. I can't tell you what the best way of nominating a judge is, but if you're looking at the pluses and the minuses, the pluses of seniority, not because it was just a tradition. I mean, you can look beyond that. The pluses are greater than the minuses significantly. That is the only appointment in public service. After all, we are part of the government. It is the only office that you are not competing for. You don't need to appease or appeal to those who appoint you. After all, judges are human beings as well. And the price, if you think that it is different, because those who are elected to the High Court are capable of also filling later on the role of Chief Justice, in other words, the President of the High Court, what we call Chief Justice. So is it because someone owes something to someone? Well, the reality is that when someone actually wants to fill a role and be nominated for something, you were asking about whether they're influenced by various winds, in the air, and they want to be appointed, let's say, then he's a human being. Maybe he'll say, maybe, after all, they may have that little that sort of frailness that they may say, oh, yes, maybe I ought to do something, so I'll appeal. But let's say someone wants to be a Chief Justice, and goodness, at the time when you read his rulings and you look at the Supreme Court, I think to a certain degree he disappointed the people who really, maybe the same with Miriam Naor as well, that they disappointed the people that perhaps he was sort of as if elected by. So are you really trying? There's one word that you say about judges, you can say about a whole group, but there's one word that I don't like. We're not a gang of the rule of law, but they are professional people, so don't give us all sorts of slogans and nicknames. Some are more sort of devoted to various basic values and others less. We do not have shared basic values in our society. We are rifted and totally different society with various rifts. What can one do? There are basic values that do unify the judges, even if there's controversy about these issues. Yes, I must say that when Judge Grunis was elected, there was this whole issue of basic law, but he was elected, by the way, he was a candidate because of seniority. First of all, they spoke about all these issues of the allowances, and then they shortened it, never mind. But the issue is that we remained with that seniority tradition. And all I'm saying, that the struggle for a specific office that you want to fill, and in all, I mean, if you're chief of the general staff and the head of the police force or whatever it is, it's natural. There are always issues like that. That is the only nomination, the only election that is taken for granted, self-evident. You do not start analyzing why they're there. The moment they are in the Supreme Court, they can also be the Chief Justice. So politicians very often sort of emulate that from their and pattern it from their world that they know of. I think that a ruling or a verdict that he writes will not necessarily be the decisive one. Sometimes I was in a minority vote as well. minority decision. So in other words, it doesn't really matter. So why do you care about that? All I said is that it's natural that someone will, if a promotion exists, he'll want to be promoted. Okay, let's leave that on the back burner for a moment. When you're talking about the committee for the nomination of judges, there as well you can understand the criticism about when the Minister of Justice comes and says, but you don't need to elect people by the relative actual majority. And then someone else wrote a letter and said, no, it was as if you were wielding unfair pressure. Why does that sort of, if you could just vote and sort of explain all that? I don't want to even relate to that whole issue. I don't even remember what it was about. The issue is that this is a system that needs to work independently. That is the most important. Its clout is that it is independent. It is not dependent on anything else. There are three authorities, three arms, the actual executionary arm and the legislative arm. They are all elected. This is different, and you see this all around the world when we discuss accountability. This is basically the auditing arm that is supervisory. Now, what are the criteria? Most specifically here, you can think that it's a very nice idea because the court does influence and it does work based on values, and the nomination of judges committee you've got a minister of justice, another minister from the government, 2 members of Knesset, they're on the committee, opposition, coalition, well, it was decided they'd all be from the coalition, doesn't matter, but there's also, you've got the actual bar representation. They've also got perhaps political aspirations. And you have the judges, or the judicial authority. In other words, the judges are actually represented in the process. So if in the past a normal majority was 9 and 5, but 9 was sufficient. And then the law said, Gideon Saar actually proposed it. He came to me at the time when I was the Chief Justice. And he explained why he wants this amendment of the law, because he said it would give the politicians more power, but it would enable you to have a veto. And perhaps there is a price that you have to pay, but you can, a slight compromise. But the understanding was that there's a compromise between the political representatives and the judges, who really, despite all the legends and how they determine things, they're just a minority, by the way, on the committee. And it's a very unpleasant situation. And all the judges, I mean, really, it's all really basically been decided on. But it really does commit people to have an agreement, a consensus on this. I think it's natural, but what are the criteria that a politician has in order to nominate a judge? He hasn't read the rulings and the verdicts, and the Minister of Justice says, is it one of ours or not one of ours? But the court is not one of ours. It's never... That's never a criteria whether, in other words, they belong to a specific partisan part, and the level, the standard, and I sincerely hope, and the independence, that independence will be respected. So can you connect between those processes that you've identified between the court and independence and other experiences that our democracy is experiencing? I think you have to be very cautious, but unfortunately, yes, there is an ongoing gnawing away of this, a corrosion that does actually relate to concepts, perceptions. Democracy is such a big word, so we have to speak very sort of cautiously and not prophesy the end of democracy. No. But for those who think that democracy in all domains is the Majority rule does not understand what we're talking about. Democracy is also the values that cohese society, that are reflected in society. They are the basic values of society, and those Jewish values included. And we have been living for years in a kind of balance of a Jewish democratic state. In other words, this law that has been now proposed, that we are talking about the nation law, the nation-state law kind of thing, about a Jewish state. Is this one of the things that substantiate this, in this risk? Yes, it's a very dangerous risk. It will change the actual balance that was determined in the Declaration of Independence, in which this country was incepted on and founded on. So the Ministry of Justice can speak about a post-Zionist institution, the court. It is one of the most Zionistic institutions. But this Jewish national state is not a question even. Not our enemy can talk about it. We were established as such. It's a sine qua non. So why, when the politicians want the right of the last word, it's okay, but when you want the right word, you're really worried about the sort of the brakes and the accelerators kind of thing? Just 6 months ago it was said, they said that we live in an insufferable reality wherein the judges nominates itself by one friend bringing another friend as trying to coerce her opinion, who then they have not won the opinion, their majority in. They do not have a widespread majority. This has to be changed. It is anti-democratic. There could not be a graver quotation than that one. I won't go over each word, but it is totally unfounded. These are not friends who bring friends and appoint friends. I spoke about the nomination. The nomination has to be done on a professional level. Why do we say that they do not sort of are greedy for strength and power? These are not people greedy for power. Those who want power, they ought to go to politics, and that's legitimate there. But a struggle against politics is part of our system, and that's legitimate, but it can't be on account of other things. So in other words, this kind of struggle with the various arms, that's also legitimate. I said at the beginning, the atmosphere that is created of delegitimization of the courts, wherein people announce that everyone comes from the neighborhood in Jerusalem, God forbid. I certainly don't think that there are judges from Rehavia in Jerusalem, one of the affluent neighborhoods, and people from the Supreme Court of Justice. They used to say it was only from the Hebrew University. We've now got lots of universities, and they all come from Haifa University, Tel Aviv University, and they were born not in that affluent Rehavia in Jerusalem, but in other places. Now, Yariv Levin actually said it. He said that there's going to be a total majority between Meretz and the Machaneh Tzionii. I don't know how he knows or thinks that. I always thought that one of the beautiful characteristics of the court, and my friends perhaps will think about that, all of those on the panel, like on the bench like me, I think that had someone else sat there, they would have said that it's naivete. I don't think it's naivete. But what is it? When Judge Barak, in his fascinating book that he published, he said, they were Bar-Ilan students, not IDC students. He said that basically this was born in the Knesset. That's naivete. All these issues about the basic laws and the revolution was in order to come and disqualify laws that were actually enacted in the Knesset. And do you really think that you sort of basically brought this calamity upon yourselves because you took the power that you have in your hands one bridge too far? And I'm deliberately saying that without you sort of saying anyone's names here. In order to explain the constitutional revolution, we need an entire session or a whole seminar on it. Here in the audience, there are one of the forefathers, Professor Amnon Rubinstein, of this constitutional revolution. He didn't do it in the courts, the Knesset, and people have spoken about that often, and if anyone wants to analyze the history of this constitutional revolution, they can see that the basic laws were decided and enacted in the Knesset. They were passed in the Knesset, and one of the reasons that because of the political constraints is that they didn't sort of exhaust all the potential of what a constitution can actually determine. So that is where the place there is room for compromise. So that is why we have the basic law of man's dignity, of human. We haven't got other basic laws, like, for example, for legislation. Yes, to my chagrin, we haven't got that. And all that issue of the Constitution, the writing of the Constitution was actually curbed. But if you're talking about naivete, I think that judges are naive when the actual courts did something that they didn't believe that the court would actually do. They knew that the court might interpret the basic laws in certain ways. In other words, the authorities that the court has taken upon themselves, if we talk about the Mizrahi law and other ones, in other words, the authorities that they took upon themselves in order to I mean, it didn't really, all these issues over the Constitution, it didn't really surprise the judges. Well, I can't attest to that, not all of them. But there are those who said that they didn't know to what degree, to what extent. I sincerely hope that they will talk about many other things. But I can say that a law embarks on its journey is always exposed to the interpretation of the courts of law. That is just, it's a given. But if it isn't acceptable, that criticism, then it will go back to the Knesset because they can re-legislate laws. So why do you sort of stand on your hind legs every time you hear about any law that might actually overtake and sort of come above the appeal, the petition laws to the High Court of Justice? But whatever was decided, if something is not legal based on the basic laws, every time that is said, that is a very big problem, because the basic laws of the state, one can actually, it isn't something that is really foolproof. It's very limited, our constitution, because there isn't a real constitution. But I think that you know that in Israeli reality that is so turbulent and sort of agitated, we're still at our formative embryonic stage. Perhaps these conventions are those that could save us, and people do not actually show them enough dignity and respect. I don't think there is any of that respect, actually. In the American Constitution, a child in school knows how to quote it. It's part and parcel of the culture they've grown up in. The Constitution accompanies every American citizen for good or bad, but they know how to quote it. But mind you, they interpret things, and sometimes if it's three sort of judges on the bench or 5, they may come out with different interpretations. But I think that when you talk about a little child in his formative years, we haven't got a consensus here, even about what is a Jewish state and what is a democratic state. These basic values are not clear-cut enough to the public or to the government, and they're it's as if they're pulling the rope in both directions. And we have to give this rather tough sort of common denominator foundation. It's very difficult. So who is all of us?
Let's forget the style for the moment. I'm talking about the essence. If the minister says, I am here in order to implement my agenda, and I think that cultural institutes that go against the country shouldn't get any money, and movies about Palestinians shouldn't get any money, that nudity shouldn't get any money. That's why I'm the Minister of Culture. That's why I want to say it. So in this struggle that I'm talking about, formative age, she says, I have something to say about it. Why can I and you cannot? It's not that I have something to say. I have power. The courts, as the minister said, in fact, they have no wallet, definitely not a sword. But the Minister of Culture does have a wallet, and the government has as well. And there are issues, unfortunately, I'm not talking politics, but there are issues that the order of priorities is wrong. in a state where there's poverty and gaps and violence, what bothers the minister, whether the freedom of expression will be limited. I'm not talking about treason. We're talking about subjects that she does like, she doesn't like. That's not her role. Encouraging culture means all opinions. And to allocate budgets according to criteria, yes, but they have to be egalitarian. And the courts always said, not for this one or that one, but egalitarian criteria. And that's exactly what we have to do. There are limitations to the power of the government. And the government acts according to the law. That's the main limitation. That's what it's all about. And each person in the coalition that together is with her, tomorrow is not with her, can really disrupt all the values of the society. They have to be mutual in this government and another one. The basis is common. Otherwise, we have no life as a state. You're talking about what's happening today, and I always remember we both have a historical memory, but when you were president of the Supreme Court and you coped with various attacks, in these situations, when you sit where you sit and your hands are tied, when to attack and when to maybe be on the defense, I don't perceive the legal position as attack. No, I'm talking when you're attacked. Yes, personally. When you were attacked personally, did you ever think whether to fight back or not? It's not a question of fight back, but to go into defense because they have the power. The operative authority has the power. The jurisdiction authority can formulate norms, but it doesn't have an operative power. It all depends on the other authorities. But look, just this year, when the Supreme Court did away with the injunction regarding the gas and the Omona and the strike of the prisoners, or not to use public money for the conversion of reform and traditional. We have to take care of the rights of the various streams in society. The court doesn't decide a priori, I'm going to do this or that. What was the evacuation of Omona? You know, the one who was the president, Justice Lando, and I appreciate his contribution of the defense on rights. It took him years until people actually knew that he was a national Jew, he was a Zionist, but today when you label each and every person, they would definitely say he was a right-winger. And you have to remember what a courageous decision he had when he decided that the settlement of Elon More cannot remain there because the land was private. And he said that in the verdict. We are now going into the arena. I know we're going to have criticism. He took risks, and he wrote it. But he couldn't avoid it. He said, this is private land. You cannot. Certain conditions that people once thought when they started settling in Judea and Samaria, that because of security, you could seize private land as well. Yeah, but you're talking about a verdict 74, in 1974. You think that today the Supreme Court that gave that decision about the Omona, the question is, was it easier for Justice Lando at the time to do it or not? No, I don't think it was easier. Because of many reasons. People don't understand today what an impact there was. Begin just gained power and he said there'll be many, many settlements like Elon More. He promised settlements. This was his political message, but here is the difference. He had political messages, with all due respect, maybe better than those who are today, but not on account of human rights, not on account of the status of the courts. Today, right and left, those who are with rights or in favor of rights, and the others not. Well, you worked with Yitzhak Rabin, who was considered the left. Yes, I experienced and I heard a lot of things from him. But I must say This is a distorted perception. Human rights do not belong to the left. In the history of this country, Jabotinsky spoke about human rights. We have a huge confusion what is left and what is right. Anybody who says anything in favor of freedom of speech, we are all labeled, and if you don't agree with me, you are my enemy. This is unbelievable extremism. And I think when you said enemy, I'm sure, sorry, do you talk about the media as well? No question. No question. The media is bothersome. We said that the courts gets a lot of criticism. The media has to show some experiment, and then it's not, both Trump and Netanyahu said, the media doesn't like us. No, she said, the wife said, that the media doesn't like us in both countries. But the truth is, and that's the difference if you're asking me, media has to be independent. It is more difficult. It depends on budgets and directors, and that's the difference in the perception. The courts are independent. The media should be independent, but if you make its life impossible, then it has interest that it has to represent. So today we are sort of talking about posts in the new media and a different kind of communications, but it's easier to weaken a journalist. They do have power, and the politicians are afraid of them, but this is a completely different system of power. Okay, maybe one newspaper can fight another, but not to fight the courts. Here you're actually cutting the branch you're sitting on. And there are people, we need them, that they will not hesitate to criticize without being punished. And I think this is symptomatical. The fact that you want to deal with the courts, like the Minister Yavin says, is only a phase in the gnawing away of values of democracy. We were elected, we're going to determine, of course, but it can also be dangerous. You spoke about the nation law, 20% of a population of minorities. What about them? We're deleting them? No, but we talk about the law of infiltrators. The minister also wrote an article about governance and about her point of view. When the Supreme Court determines how long you can hold or detain infiltrator or refugee or whatever in prison in Israel, and that has to do with the policy of immigration. Yes, the policy of immigration is of the government, not of the courts, but in the history of law, not just in Israel, if there's a definite role in the courts is regarding detainment. A judge has to decide about detainment. It's human rights completely. At the time, there was one law, and the courts disqualified it, went back to the Knesset, and this is a good example, actually. Again, it came back to the court. Again, it was rejected, and the third time, it was approved. The government and the Knesset, there's proportion. When you talk about jeopardizing your rights to freedom, there are other ways to deal with it. You can and you should overcome. But here we go into the balances, the value of security. And let me say something about governance in general. I think, in my opinion, the expression governance is something archaic. You know, in an administration, when it was autocratic, there was a governor, there was a king, and he could decide anything. But what is governance? How does the government govern? Who has to actually make sure that the governance is correct? In any administration, you know, today there's globalization, and people are talking about it a lot. Foreign bodies have properties in the state, and they have an impact. Tycoons have an impact. People who have money have an impact. The companies, Google, Facebook, they have power. But under these conditions, what is governance? The government is under many pressures, sometimes illegitimate. The one who makes sure that it governs properly is the courts, not to distort anything in favor of somebody who doesn't deserve it. that the government is really going to act according to the law. Well, there's somebody else that has to do with that, and these are the other gatekeepers, maybe the Attorney General, the State Controller, the legal advisors to the government. I'm asking you whether, in your opinion, these gatekeepers are also influenced by the attack on the courts. Unfortunately, the power that the Attorney General has, or those gatekeepers, depends on the power of the courts. I've been in this opera, as we say, many, many times. You can come to the government and you can say, this is a decision that I will not be able to defend in the courts of appeal because it will be considered illegal in the eyes of the judges. But if you say, okay, the courts, oh, these are my friends from the political party, and if you talk about the judges the way you do, then you take the power away from the gatekeepers. We all act by law. We all act by the principles of law, the law of governance, human rights. Anybody who come and argue that he needs those tools acts by the fact that he believes that the court is going to give him their backing. Well, this was a beginning for another question. Do you think it's okay to demonstrate in front of the personal, private home of the government, the legal advisor to the government? Well, people dealt with it. To demonstrate you can for anything, and freedom of speech, that's what it's all about. Where to do it? Do we bother the children and the family, and then we stand at the door of his private home? That's a different question. But the issue is, I think, that you really have to leave some discretion to the legal advisor. Okay, you can demonstrate whatever you want. That's not the issue. But it's a bit a lack of understanding about his role, his position. I don't know what difficulties he has before he has to make a decision. But you have to enable him to cope with it. Yes, but people say that he's sitting on this file for a year or 2 years. I wouldn't want any person to be indicted because people shouted in the street in the demonstration that it's about time that he did make the decision. So the way shouldn't be under pressure. It has to be professional, judicial. You have to appeal. You have to go to the courts of appeal. You can find out why it's taking so much time. But the pressure, even if somebody says it bona fide, and I'm sure that he's right, I wouldn't want any decision to be taken because of pressure. But on the other hand, you know that there were many complaints in the last few years. And people say that there are like a bias towards people in government, that people are afraid to indict. They don't have the stamina, the determination or the courage that they used to have in the past. I don't give marks. You have to know exactly how things are working. But I don't know. You know, these are decisions. They're professional decisions that have to be taken according to data, according to the perception of the position. It's difficult for me to say what I would have done had I been there now. So let me ask you another thing. And I know that Shai Nitzan, the Attorney General, he was your protege. He's not protege, maybe your student. He was really your student. But I have to ask you one concrete question that really bothers everybody who cares about freedom of speech and journalism and writing books. The decision to tell the police to raid a publishing house, even if the former Prime Minister Olmert did something. What is this? Is that a possible thing? Shouldn't their hands shake before they do it? Yes, they should. You don't have to relate to the decision itself, but I also don't know what happened there. But the mere fact that you see that police raid a publishing house, I don't know. I believe that had they asked them to get the material, then the publishing house maybe would have given it to them. Maybe I'm naive. I wouldn't send police. But I really don't know everything. But, okay, last question, and it is also out of curiosity. from all the decisions you ever made during your career, you were in many positions, and finally as a president, is there a decision that you know today that was the most difficult, maybe in adoption or maybe something in security? As you said, when you cope with each question, then the difficult question, sometimes I thought that adoption was the most difficult files to deal with, because I think this is more serious and more difficult than anything that has to do with security. These are very harsh decisions, and they have to do with children. And unfortunately, today, in the news, we hear about the fate of sick children in the hospital. And I don't know, people are talking and ego fights and all sorts of authorities, even in the hospitals. There's nothing more sensitive than that. And these are decisions that really make my nights sleepless. I hope that some of these problems will be solved quickly these days. Dorit Beinisch, thank you very much.